mitochondria. So that was kind of the state of the art for a very long time, until about 600 million years ago. We had a cell that looked like this. It had a nucleus and a mitochondria. And it was still up to the same nutritional program where it was eating other cells, except this time, instead of a proteobacteria, it came upon a bacteria called a cyanobacteria. So cyanobacteria are pretty cool. Here's a nice scanning electron micrograph of some cyanobacteria. And so these bacteria actually evolved photosynthesis. And so they were able to capture light from the sun and convert it to sugars. And so it was one of these cells that our eukaryote consumed. And just like with the mitochondria, that chloroplast or bacteria was not digested, and instead eventually became the chloroplast. And so when you look at the structure of these organelles, you can actually see kind of the remnants of their former independent lives. And so both the chloroplast and the nucleus actually have their own DNA, and they produce some of their own proteins, though they are very heavily dependent on their host cells. All right, so now we have our cell that has a chloroplast in it. So we should be ready to start doing some photosynthesis. Yeah?
So those cyanobacteria just photosynthesized before they were?
Yes. Yeah. So there's actually many different species of cyanobacteria that all can do photosynthesis. And one particular species was captured and became a chloroplast. What's particularly interesting is that scientists are pretty sure that each of these events only happened once. And so all of our cells are descended from this single event. And then all plant cells are descended from this single event, which is pretty incredible. All right. So we have a chloroplast. Yeah.
With I guess maybe I just don't understand fundamentally how DNA works then.
Hmm?
Because how can you absorb something else and then now, oh, it's written in. When I make a new cell, this thing is magically now going to appear for the rest of our... How does that fundamentally happen? That seems pretty impossible.
Yeah, so it's quite a rare occurrence for this to actually happen and get passed along. But some of the same mechanisms that bacteria use to divide and replicate themselves are actually used by the mitochondria and the chloroplast to replicate themselves and pass it along. And then over all of those millions of generations, a lot of the DNA that was originally in the mitochondria and the chloroplast actually got moved to the nucleus. And so now the two organelles are really, truly dependent on the nucleus.
Like randomly? It's just sort of like that those chemicals just like moved to this area?
Yeah, so it's not super well understood how exactly that happened, but it's a good question though. All right. So we can see, like I was saying, there's a lot of structural similarities that remain between the chloroplast and their cyanobacterial ancestors. So we're going to do photosynthesis, so we need to somehow capture the energy of light. And so before we get to that, we need to talk just a little bit about what light actually is. And so light is interesting because it has both a wave and a particle nature. So we talk about particles of light as being these kind of packets called photons, and these photons have an energy level which we describe using the term wavelength. So visible light, which is the range of light that plants are going to be using for photosynthesis, occurs in this sort of narrow spectrum here along all of our different possible wavelengths. So it runs from something like 300 or 400 nanometers, which is a billionth of a meter, all the way up to about 800 nanometers. And so the actual capture of light is done by pigment molecules. So the one that you've probably heard of before is called chlorophyll. So this is a structure of a particular chlorophyll called chlorophyll A. And there's a number of other chlorophylls. So most plants will have chlorophyll A and chlorophyll B, which are fairly similar in structure. And so chlorophyll A can absorb light only in certain wavelengths. And so this graph is showing the proportion of light that is absorbed by the pigment as dependent on wavelength. And so what we can see is that chlorophyll A will do a pretty good job absorbing light kind of down here at the bottom of the spectrum in the purple and blue region, and then also at the higher end of the spectrum in the red region. What we can also see is here that it does a very bad job at absorbing green light. And so since it's not absorbing the green light, we know that it's actually reflecting that green light. And so there's our answer to our first objective, which is why are plants green? That's because they have lots and lots of chlorophyll pigments in their leaves. And so the green part of the light that's coming into the leaf is being reflected back out, and that's what we're seeing.